Let's proceed, though, by thinking about him. By the way, I pulled out an old postcard collection of mine and discovered one that I think is from the Boston Museum of Art, which many of you have been to, I'm sure. Beautiful painting of, guess who? Henry VIII's physician. God, could you imagine having that job? So, I mean, telling him, well, we want to cut back a little bit on meat. We want to have more greens, go to the gym, and maybe stop drinking quite as much. He could be right here. I wouldn't want to give advice, sound as it might be. So, that would not be a job I would want. The great business, as it came to be known at the court, and every court in Europe, I'm strongly convinced, including the papal court in Rome, dealt with the dissolution of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and his marriage to the pregnant Anne Boleyn. Part of it, of course, has to do with the dissolving of the marriage on the supposed religious ground that one cannot marry one's brother's widow. And since she insisted vehemently that it had not been a true marriage with Arthur, she would never consent to the dissolution of that marriage. To try to obtain papal consent would not have been a problem for Clement VII, except for the fact that he could not afford the wrath of Catherine's nephew. And we know about those family ties. Catherine's nephew, who was then Charles V, the emperor. There is, of course, a fear on the part of the Pope that if he offends Charles V, it could create problems with the empire. It's a no-win situation, I suspect. And I suspect this fellow, as well as his uncle before him, who was Pope Leo X, were also in the throes of the Protestant Reformation, lest we forget. So they had problems aplenty in this 16th century. I don't want to say they thought about nothing except English issues. They had other concerns. Just in case you have forgotten this tree, Joanna of Castile, as you recall, I think Janet mentioned that, Juana la Loca. And that's because, obviously, she had issues. And you see that she and her sister, Catherine of Aragon, were married to prominent kings, Castile and England. And they were the daughters of Ferdinand and Isabella, the prominent couple. There's Charles V, and we will get into other issues like people falling in love at reunions, maybe. Because I know those long Thanksgiving, maybe we look too often after the turkey. Philip II and Mary I. Yeah, so strange but true. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that connection between the two of them, but as we get to it, I mean, they would think, oh, it's just a beautiful Catholic marriage. Just could not be nicer. Except there were, of course, issues. Many issues. Meanwhile, Campeggio, as we talked about last time, will be sent back with Wolsey to attempt to negotiate the king's great business and try to stall. No one thinks Wolsey was told about all of this, but we understand that Henry VIII was not a man who was prepared for a slow, drawn-out process. Remember, he has a pregnant girlfriend, right? And as we used to say in the South, she was showing. So we need to get married because we do not want a little love child. We want a legitimate one. The poignancy, at least to me, of Catherine begging her husband and reminding him of her fidelity and loyalty, and his, of course, ignoring her is a very famous issue. Famous depiction, I should say. Here is our Thomas Cromwell, and some of you have told me about seeing the new and revised Thomas Cromwell, the nicer Cromwell, than is depicted by Holbein, at least in my opinion, because the Cromwell, at least that the old historians told us about, was anything but a nice guy. He was definitely a career administrator who had lots of power and wanted to keep it, and he was prepared to use torture or any other device he had to bring about the king's will. Just a thoroughly unpleasant fellow, but again, television provides us with a new and improved Thomas Cromwell. Just took us several centuries to get there. Now, here's one of my heroes, Thomas Cranmer, the Oxford professor who went on to become the first, shall we call him, Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury. He is the individual coming out of an academic career who said theologically he understood how Henry felt. And it's sort of like you're sitting in the teacher's lounge one day, and the next day you're pulled out and said, the king likes your arguments, and so you're going to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. He really did come out of a deeply academic background. Not at all in terms of power, politics, or great royal administrator. It's simply that he saw from an intellectual point of view, biblical if you will, that the king was correct. Well, we love people who agree with us. So, I don't know how much he wanted to be Archbishop of Canterbury because he had certain issues. One issue was Mrs. Cranmer. Now, love is a beautiful thing, but when you're going to be Archbishop of Canterbury and you have a wife, at this point, it's really not a good thing. And so she traveled with him in a trunk. She did. Portable wife. Well, it's like you can come out, I'll sort of, and then you can come out. She was a German Lutheran, and she realized that, you know, an English archbishop was not supposed to be married. So I guess she had to be careful because Henry VIII would not have approved of Frau Cranmer, believe you me. Oh, no. And just in case anybody has forgotten, when he was a much younger person, either in reality or ghost-written, he wrote a book called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments. Henry VIII was, at least on paper, soundly Catholic in his theology. So again, the idea of "Hey, King, I want you to meet my better half. Come on out, honey. Come on out, take a bow, Frida." It's not locked, so just jump out. So there's a bit of insincerity, but again, you like your head on your body, so I understand reasons for his reluctance to describe his marital status. So, with Catherine's marriage to Henry dissolved, and again, not divorced, because strictly speaking, they had never really been married. So now, Henry, who is, as it were, unmarried, now marries the very pregnant, didn't know there were degrees, but this very ultra pregnant Anne Boleyn. And so this man, Thomas Cranmer, plays a great role in our story, and it is only beginning at this point, as those of you who are familiar with the Episcopal Church will well appreciate. No, he wasn't an Episcopalian, but he does have great influence in the development of the Church of England. More, of course, is an interesting figure. You can view More in various ways. The Catholic Church views him as a saint, as some people know. Others view him as a great humanist who stood up for what he thought was true and righteous. And others point out that he may have ghost-ridden things that cast aspersions on the character of Richard III, the big bad king back in the late 15th century, you will recall, at the behest of the Tudors. Whatever the case, he gave us the word utopia, I suppose, so that's the first time, as I understand it, that the word comes into common usage. So there are many ways that Thomas More is an interesting figure, and what a pity that Henry would insist that More become part of his government. If you haven't seen A Man for All Seasons, let me recommend it to you highly, not only for the acting and the play upon which it was based, but I think also because of his qualities of moral strength that are portrayed there. And some of you will remember his wife, the great actress Dame Wendy Hiller, who would portray his impatient wife trying to get him to accede to the king's wishes to recognize the king's marriage. But of course, More wasn't going to do it. And the irony, of course, being that the king had gotten him involved in the government in the first place, and he could have stayed home and not been involved at all. Again, at the time, it won many awards, as I recall. I think he beat out, now this will take you back in Hollywood history, I think he beat out Richard Burton for Best Actor that year in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. So Kenneth More became known for that particular role as Thomas More. You see Wendy Hiller there. So, Princess Dowager of Wales, and that's the end of Catherine of Aragon. Most cruelly, but perhaps for reasons we can understand, she was kept apart much of the time from her only daughter. I guess the king was a bit paranoid in terms of possible plots against him, but for whatever reason, it was a cruel thing to do, particularly because one doesn't think that he was necessarily so interested in his daughter either. So in many ways, I think you will agree that the future Queen Mary did not grow up as a loved and happy child, even though her mother was, of course, deeply devoted to her. And there is Anne. In many ways, Anne Boleyn, as we say about so many people these days, is a victim. I mean, everybody's a victim, I guess, of circumstances. You know, I started thinking in the shower, as I do a lot of my good thinking, about the various women who were married to Henry VIII. And it's not like, you know, when you're in the 6th or 7th grade and some little boy might slip you a note and say, I like you, I don't like you, maybe, check the box. I don't think these women were always in that position of like a debate society. I think they were usually being used by great families, like the Boleyns, for their own particular interests. We talked last time about Anne's father, and so that's the way that people use daughters for these particular interests. And when Anne failed to carry out her purpose by having a daughter and a stillborn son, and I don't know, I guess people debate this, I can't imagine why, but that Henry had grown tired of her and she could be unpleasant. Well, I mean, I don't think he's exactly Mr. Loveboat, but I mean, I would hate to wake up with somebody like that. But anyway, the fact is that he had the power and she didn't. So, Mr. Wonderful and always pleasant Thomas Boleyn on television, Thomas Cromwell, sorry, brought in George Boleyn, all in these other men, and tortured them into confessing adultery with Anne Boleyn. It's amazing, isn't it? It's very doubtful that Anne Boleyn would have been that stupid. And the idea of George Boleyn is almost incomprehensible. But they all died, as would she. Recovering from the loss of a loved one can sometimes be slow and painful. Other times, as we like to say, we can rather quickly process our grief. And believe me, he was ready to move on. Boy, oh boy. He didn't have to go to a site, very little dating. I think he had already dated, if in the loosest sense of that verb, because Jane Seymour had been a member of the court of Anne Boleyn. It's interesting to get that position as a member of a court. I'm thinking, well, who are you really working for here? I mean, you're supposed to be in the service of the Queen, but you're also, well, you know, they would say on call for other members of the royal family. So that's kind of unfortunate, but I think Jane Seymour, again, the Seymours, you know, get in there and get busy. You can do this, you know, get that esprit de corps going in. So Jane Seymour was busy. They married the day of or the day after Anne Boleyn's execution. I know, that's what I'm talking about, processing grief. I mean, this is, you know, What can help more than another honeymoon, okay? So there you have it. And they were busy because he needed a son. So he said, you know, it'd be nice if we could have dinner and wine, maybe some music, but I just want the son. So let's get right on it. And, you know, like I said about the Ford company, job number one, you know, that kind of thing. Let's get busy. And the next thing you know, she has the son, dying in childbirth, unfortunately. But the Seymour family isn't dead, and believe you me, we'll hear more about them shortly. Now, before we go on with more wives, because we've only reached halftime on the wife department, and he's going to stay single after her death. I think he is not going to practice a state of chastity. But I do think he'll say, you know, maybe I can wait a while for marriage. Meanwhile, however, the whole process of going through the dissolution of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon is definitely going to affect the state of England and its relationships with other powers, because he, of course, will carry this out by legislative fiat. The existence of Parliament is a given by now. It doesn't mean we are prepared for a Parliament in which some people will agree or disagree. I can't imagine they'll get up there and say, well, Your Majesty, I don't know if we think this is a good policy. You're not called to debate my policies. You're called to support my policies. And if you're not, go home. I hate you. You know, that guy. It's very easy. So there doesn't seem to be any dissent in accepting the idea that the king is now going to be head of the church. And you know what that means. Ciao, Papa. No more Pope. It means, in effect, the ending of papal authority. And this Act 1533, and think about how quickly all this is going to come about. 1533, Act and Restraint of Appeals, and you know who the appeals were to, the Pope. So that's cut off. If you're thinking about it, just say no. Because it's now not only unwarranted, but it's illegal. Now, we've had this talking about Henry II, Thomas Becket, if you want to go way back. For these folks, that was way back for them. What, 300 years? But, yes, Henry VIII thought of Henry II as being a great hero, because Henry II had fought against church freedom. And so Henry VIII will look back and say, wow, man, you were great, the way you kicked some Pope authority. Yeah, that's what I want to do. The act of supremacy. I am head of the church, supreme head of the church, no less. You say, but he's a layman. What's your point? He's going to see himself, as I say, as a kind of king, priest, a la Melchizedek in the Bible. And I have the authority. And who's going to stand up and say, I don't agree with that point. I don't think I would agree, because, you know, he was pro-capital punishment. He really believed in it. He supported it enthusiastically. And, I mean, they were going. And family connections did not help. Believe you me, that even made it worse. So, the idea that he was supreme head, and he is almost the only one who's going to bear that title, by the way. But he is, as we're going to see, because they'll change the title later on. But supreme head. The restraint of annates, Susie was asking me about this. Annates were a tax, I would call it, that was paid to the papacy by the bishops. When you became a bishop, they did an estimate of the value of your bishopric. And it's kind of like, they just figure out how much this is going to be worth. And you say, well, gosh, I don't have to pay it all up front. Oh, no. You just pay it the rest of your life, as long as you're bishop. You'll pay it annually. There'll be fees. So these are the annates. Well, that's the end of that. As far as going to Rome, that is. You know where it's going. The act of succession. Well, of course, that has to do with who will be the new ruler. And that will be the child produced by the now dead Jane Seymour. And that, of course, will be Edward VI. Mary, to succeed him, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. And then, as it turned out, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth. If, almost impossible to imagine, something should happen to both Edward VI and Mary. Could you fancy that? Could you imagine? But, yes, that was all legally decided by Henry VIII in that act of succession. And it is going to be very important because in some cases, these people are not exactly to win popularity contests. Now, what always had interested me is there are not going to be a lot of protests. You don't hear about people marching outside the palace, we love our Pope, and up with Papa, or any of that. And you wonder if the masses of people are just not as aware of all that's going on, because in his way, Henry VIII was just super Catholic. I mean, in terms of theology, ritual, and all the rest, there was no problem. It's just he wanted to run it all. He simply did not want a pope around. Now, there were some great people, and those of you who are Roman Catholics may well recognize their names, because John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, who was executed, was made a saint, as was Thomas More. In addition, 18 monks were executed. Well, and that's tragic and heroic simultaneously. But one is struck with how few there are. That most say, well, que sera, sera. We have to go along. We've loved the papal period, and now we've got a royal period. When will my next check be coming in for my bishopric? It's like you just serve the one you're with. And it would seem that more or less the changes were accepted, because the alternative was to be a martyr. So it's not like there's a middle ground. I guess you could just leave. You could go live in France or hang out with the Pope or something. But if you intended to make your home in the British Isles, let's just say that you would accept royal authority. Now, the Pope, and this is a beautiful painting, isn't it? He's here with two of his nephews. Paul III, doesn't he look sweet? But let me tell you, there was some fire underneath that sweet look. And so he'd had some nephews along the way, but he was behaving by now. So when he was Pope, he was very ferocious, and he sent letters and warnings to Henry VIII, and finally he got tired of it, and he said, well, this will fix it. It didn't. The excommunication and the interdict, in the good old days, back in my day, the reign of Innocent III, it worked. King John just said, oh, I'm scared. But Henry VIII said, you know what you can do with your interdict and excommunication, you old idiot. Just rude, right? Oh, and he wrote him back, Bishop of Rome, insult, big time. But they love that. They love to do that. Bishop of Rome, as if he's not head of the whole church, So those are fighting words. So, Paul III did not get his way with Henry, and Henry now was supreme head of the church. Now, Henry wanted only one change, and that was no more monasteries. You might say, well, I would love monasteries. Monasteries are good places. Yes, they are for some. But they had lots and lots of land, lots of property. And where land comes, there is wealth, and there is lust. And there came the heart of Henry VIII. In dissolving the monasteries by our television friend, Thomas Cromwell, who sent around commissions on monasteries, evaluation committees, I can just imagine. They thought, tut, we're not living by the Benedictine rule. You're going to get a low rating, ratemymonastery.com, that kind of thing. You can just imagine. They're all getting bad reports. Convents as well, sisters aren't living right. They're kind of lax. Maybe the meals are too big, and they're not praying enough, or they give too many A's in their classes, all kinds of things. So basically, all of this will allow, in certain waves, the monasteries and convents to be shut down. It's an amazing process. And wouldn't you love to know when they came in, the lay commissioners, and said, okay, everybody's out of here. You wonder if it would be like kind of Alcatraz or San Quentin or something, and they said, all you inmates, skedaddle, you're out of here. Or people were really upset. It was said the younger ones were probably, skipping out and, yay, new life. The older ones were probably sad. I think it would be hard. You don't want to have to start a new job or something, or have to go dating, or, go out and look for somebody and say, no, I know I'm older, but I've never been married, but how do you do this dating thing? That's like, you've been a nun since you were 10 years old or something. That people very young could become nuns. So it was a tough life for many people. And this process gradually takes place. The lusty eyes of the tutors and their entourage are now in process of taking possessions of all these massive lands. And I love to remind people that's where Downton Abbey comes from the lands of the great abbey, which was there. And these people are so high and mighty and all of that. But you know what their ancestors were? Thieves. Amen. They were bourgeois upstarts. And they took all that land. And you think, oh, well, I bet they wrote a nice check to that particular charity. I don't think so. I think maybe a lot of these monks and nuns might have gotten jobs in the local schools if they were lucky. But maybe they could do handiwork. I don't know. But it's not good to be an unemployed monk or nun. Let me put it that way. It's particularly not helpful. Now, if you're younger, you can probably get out on the dating scene. Hang out at a tavern, meet people, I don't know. But I'm thinking, most folks, I think it would be very hard. The so-called pilgrimage of grace may have been stirred up by the Scots because it was way up north. And essentially, this is a peasant revolt put down by Henry VIII's forces, which protested the closing of the monasteries. Sometimes this has been made out to be this great religious or pious protest in support of monks and nuns. But other scholars insist this is more objection to the fact that these wealthy lay people are now going to acquire all these lands and probably make circumstances for the peasants much more difficult. In other words, it's a case of who do you want to work for? Would you rather work for a monastery or do you want to work for a big layman? Who's going to give you the better deal? In any event, the pilgrimage of grace is one of the few known examples of protest against Henry's policy. And, you might say, people may not have, by the 16th century, monasteries and convents in general, the religious life may not have been that popular anymore. It served a wonder. Today, it's very hard to get people to go into the religious life. In the 20th century, it was probably a lot easier in the first half, let's say. Things change. And people feel like maybe during the reign of Henry VIII and beyond, it was just not as important as it had been in earlier centuries. And so, while this is a dramatic way to end it, it certainly was not one that created a lot of passion. Now, Cranmer is still Archbishop of Canterbury, and Mrs. Cranmer is living a very secretive life, okay? She's around, and one would assume that she didn't get to go to that many parties, and if people came over to their house, he'd say, "Oh, have you met, this is Helga, this is my German cook, anybody for Wiener Schnitzel?" That kind of thing, because you have to explain, what's she doing there? We can't stay in the trunk all the time. So you get out there, and it's just a very, very odd thing, and until he's dead, she remains as more or less a secretive Mrs. Cranmer. He had been trained theologically in Germany, so we don't have to be surprised that he had Lutheran tendencies. Not surprising at all. What surprises me is that he was able to fool Henry VIII. I guess he could throw in so many words like transubstantiation or things like that, and Henry the Catholic goes, "Oh, you're talking my language," that kind of thing, So, yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's really kind of funny when you think about it. And he persuaded, for a time, that Bibles in English would be allowed in churches. Heretofore, a Bible that would be in English would have been considered somewhat dangerous, because the idea is if the Bible remains in Latin, it will be available on a need-to-know basis. And you folks who can't read Latin, we'll explain to you what you need to know. So you don't have to worry about it because we have Latin, you don't have Latin. And as you see here, it's very interesting that the king went on, I think, according to Cranmer, and Cranmer was kind of pursuing a dangerous line here. But I think he was trying to get the king to ease up a bit by allowing English Bibles in church. And maybe the king was so busy with his love life and other issues, he said, sure, whatever, do it, Cranmer. And then the king changed his tune. And the king went what I would call hardline, and that is the 6 Articles, 1539. Let's look at those 6 Articles. I don't want to give a long discussion of pre-Vatican II Catholic beliefs, but these beliefs, and this is interesting now, these beliefs, according to Henry VIII, these are going to be laws of the state. So you can't say, well, yes, I'm living in the realm, but I'm not really part of the church. Thank you anyway. I think the only way you could get away with that if you were one of the tiny number of people who were Jewish. But anyone else, if you had said, well, I'm really a Lutheran, so I don't really go with this stuff. I don't think that would have been good for your health, okay? I just don't think. So basically then, these 6, I love number 4. There's a certain irony there, isn't there? But chastity's good for some people, just not for me. Private masses, meaning you don't have to have a mass in church. It's like a priest can do it any old time. I went to a place once where Henry VII had perpetual private masses said for his son Arthur, and I was so touched. Because I think, the idea being that Arthur was so young, you just offer perpetual masses over and over again so that he can get out of purgatory. So he shouldn't have been there that long because he was just a teenager. Celibacy of the clergy, on and on. Now, does this sound very Protestant to you? Well, no. It's hardline Henry VIII. And if you don't like it, you can shut up, die, or get out of England. So that's what we call free will. You can do just what you want to. The results of all this we'll see after the 5-minute break. Thank you. All right, here we go. How's that sound? Is that okay? Everybody hear it? Tom, Michelle? Well, does it need to be cut down a little bit? Okay. How strictly these 6 articles were enforced, it would be interesting to know, if they did spot checks at local parishes to make sure that everybody was doing that, and maybe some rector somewhere might have a special friend. You never know about things like that. But those of you who were ever, when you were in college, and I was a fraternity advisor for many years, and we always had people who came around from the national organization, consultants. And I always think about consultants when I think about enforcing these procedures, because everybody, when the consultant comes, all the boys were so angelic, and we were all, dinner was delicious, but perhaps we need now to repair to the Ralph Brown Drawn Library to pursue our studies. That kind of thing. And I kept wondering, how much of this will these consultants believe? because it really was amazing to see that these theatrical performances, because I am sure they had no intention of any intellectual pursuit. As far as these, however, it seems to me that most were put into place to enforce the king's Catholic beliefs, but no pope. Now, does it mean no monks and nuns? I don't think so. It's just that the land's gone. That was the main thing there. And enter any international monastic organizations, of which there were quite a few, like the Cluniacs and the Cistercians and the Franciscans and the Dominicans and all the rest of them. That wouldn't have been allowed, because now we just have what? A Royal English Catholic Church under Henry VIII. Meanwhile, Thomas Cromwell's days are going to be numbered. Now again, not to mention the television Thomas Cromwell one more time, but this Thomas Cromwell, the real one, went a little too far. Presumably going on a mission to a Protestant ruler. Because you understand, when he's fishing around, when he gets on the marriage market again after Jane Seymour, Henry VIII is going to find that many of the Catholic European courts are saying, no, we're not going to have our daughters married to someone like you because you're not a supporter of the papacy. So Cromwell gets the bright idea, it was hazardous to his health, that the king marry a Protestant. Anne of Cleves came from a devoutly Lutheran family, Cleves being a state within the Holy Roman Empire. Hans Holbein, the great painter, this is when you wish you could do selfies with those telephones, don't you? But Holbein was there to paint the portrait of Anne of Cleves, and Henry saw it and said, you know, oh boy, yeah, you know, I'm sure, so attractive. And then she arrived in England. Not a good decision. Now, people ask, but was that special night of romance? No. People debated, but they don't believe there was a honeymoon. He had papers drawn up the next day that there she is. That is the Holbein painting. And that she became Princess Dowager of Wales. That title was now available. Catherine of Aragon was dead by now. So that title is available. And she lived the rest of her life in England, not surprisingly becoming a strong advocate of Protestantism. Spanish, she took a lot of English classes, and you know, so she could be bilingual. But yeah, she lived on. I can't say the same, however, for Thomas Cromwell. When you get a bad job evaluation, sometimes the consequences can be lethal. And in his case, he had to go. And there is something ironic about it. For me, it's not unlike in the French Revolution when Danton and other great leaders like Robespierre are guillotined. You know, if it's good enough for everybody else, it's good enough for you. So, head chopping, here I come. And there goes Thomas Cromwell, and another of the great advisors or people in the story of Henry VIII. Oh dear. Catherine Howard. Again, we love ourselves year-olds, and it's good to be young and lighthearted. But it's not good to be married to a middle-aged man who is jealous and possessive. She was used by her family, surprise, surprise. And that's, of course, why she was married to him. Apparently, she already had a special fellow in her life. Yeah. So, this whole business was a definite misadventure. And she'll be executed the next year. Yeah. Now, that's a double standard. So I think poor Catherine Howard, who happened to be the cousin of Anne Boleyn, as some of you may know, was lighthearted, accepted responsibility for her failure, for not being pure when she married Henry VIII. His jealousy, I think they found correspondence that indicated it. It was just a tragic business. The final wife, Catherine Parr, who outlived him, interests me because she was actually in love with the brother of Jane Seymour. Remember Jane Seymour? It is like a soap opera, isn't it? General Hospital has nothing on these people. Because really, she simply wanted to marry him. She'd been married before. But when the king had an interest in her, she said, you know, Thomas, I really love you, but I really feel like it's my duty to marry the king. So she married him and outlasted him long enough to marry Thomas Seymour and live briefly. So that's how the saga of his wives were. And I think she had good relations with his children, too. So I've always had a special thing about Catherine Parr. She was somebody that dealt with the situation with the hand she got in life and made the best of it. So, what would follow Henry? Yes, 55 years old. It has been said he died of syphilis, but that is almost just too perfect. I expect we could just count all of the diseases. Well, yeah, you know more than I do, but I'm thinking gout's a real good possibility. Renal, yes. And how about cirrhosis? Yeah. So, yeah, we could make out a whole list, but I don't want to get caught practicing without a license. Let's just say that by the time he got middle-aged, he was in bad condition. And so I suspect in those last years, it was clear to those around him. You know how it is when you're a ruler like that. When people see you're weak or you're going, they start looking around and thinking, what's next? What's coming up? And that probably included our Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, because he still had his head on his body. And he was looking for a great new world. The great new world of post-Henry VIII in terms of change. And it does look like it, doesn't it? I just wonder sometimes, I mean, the pain he must have suffered. And again, I hope he really hurt a lot. Because he really was he just wasn't a nice person. And then there's Edward. Isn't that a wonderful little painting? He's just a boy. Jane Seymour's son. He never had a mother. She died in childbirth. And we all love, remember the Prince and the Pauper? So yeah, he's one of those figures out of our childhood that we remember, the little boy that's by himself. And I don't know about what his relations would have been like with his sisters, his older sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. But he was definitely going to come into power nominally, because obviously there were people around him who were ready to lead in his name. And that would, of course, include Archbishop Cranmer. And I suspect there were indications from all we know about Cranmer that he was just bursting out with Lutheran ideas, that he kept kind of, oh yes, Your Majesty, I love the 6 Acts. Let me just recite them. I could just say them, backwards and forwards. But behind the scenes, he's probably singing "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." You just don't know. He got some Lutheran tendencies, seriously. As far as his uncle, well, don't mean to say bad things about uncles, but I think we can safely assume that James Seymour's brother had ideas of ruling in his nephew's name. Because basically Henry VIII has more or less killed off all the other male rivals. It's not, you look around and it's, oh no, he's dead. It's amazing how they cleaned out the Yorkists and other people who were around during, I call it the Tower of London period, when they came and went. They checked in but never checked out, so to speak. So, yeah, there he is, Edward Seymour. That title, Duke of Somerset, would of course mean that he could lead the government on behalf of his nephew. Now, technically, of course, Edward is the king, but again, he is a child. So Thomas is going to have power, and what we find interesting about that is that Thomas must have been sympathetic also to these Protestant ideas. So, see, I don't think Cranmer would have come out. By the way, Mrs. Cranmer, out of the closet, man. I'm free, I'm a wife, and they go, wow. No more trunk for you, lady. So, yeah, absolutely, yeah. It's going to be a very different world. And we are ready for, yes, Episcopalians, the Book of Common Prayer. Yes, exactly. Rah, rah. The Book of Common Prayer. In English, the services, or most of them, in English, and in a form of English that, I don't know if you'd agree, Carol, but I think it's considered very literary styling from what I know. Yeah, it's beautiful. If you've ever gone to an Episcopal church, or you're familiar with the services, it's hard to forget some of the phrasing and that's often Cranmerian. But again, Latin to English in his particular style. With, of course, amendments to reflect the changes from some Catholic teachings to some Protestant teachings. However, Seymour, that is Somerset, did not last, and here is where matters get a bit complex. Look at the years. This all takes place in 6 years. It's amazing Edward VI, he was more like his uncle Arthur. He didn't live. You wonder if this is a genetic business or exactly what was wrong with him, but I'm not aware that he had a long, healthy period. I am aware, however, that regardless of his condition, he couldn't save his uncle. or at least other counselors around him didn't like him. So he's axed, literally and figuratively. Yeah, I mean, it's not enough to be the king's uncle. You're dead. And let's see where he comes along the line. We're now at Edward VI. You see him up there with his sisters. And you can see the Seymours. You see Edward Seymour and then the two sons. And you will also notice Jane Grey. What a story that is. What a tragic and romantic story that is. But you see that connection from the daughter of Henry VIII, Henry VII rather. I mentioned this a long time ago, but you see nobody talks very much about Margaret and Mary, the sisters of Henry VIII, but if you look up there and you see them, they did have a great significance because Lady Jane Grey is the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII. Because this is a real bare tree, so you can see the biggies. so it's a good thing. And remember how she was married twice? She was married a brief time to the King of France, and she came back home and married, and then she had her family. So that's Our Lady Jane Grey. And how she came to be the ruler is through this individual, the Duke of Northumberland. He was one of the colleagues of Thomas Seymour, and he just took over the government. And this little boy tells little Edward, he said, you know, your uncle was bad, and he had to be relieved, and he passed away. And he said, oh, well, thanks for the news. Are you going to help me now? He said, oh, yes. I love you, Eddie. Or something. It's all very sinister, right? But all of this is to say, then he takes his son. He says, guess what, kid? He says, what, Daddy? I've got someone I want you to date. And maybe, of course, guess who? Lady Jane Grey. How do they think up these things? Well, it was pretty easy in the case of Lady Jane Grey. She had a connection to Henry VII. Remember that? Granddaughter of Mary. And her family had interest in Lutheran and other Protestant teachings. Check, check. You pass all the qualifications for marriage. So, my son and Lady Jane Grey, let him go to the junior prom or whatever, and then marriage, yeah, I do. However, the problem would be, as Lady Jane Grey married Northumberland's son, Edward VI's health failed. And as a result, Northumberland found himself in great trouble. Because, of course, while he persuaded Edward VI, while he was ill, to change Henry VIII's last will in succession, to leave the throne to Jane Grey, it never worked out. Remember this painting? I just love that painting. I think it's so beautiful. Well, I mean, you see how, and she's dressed so nicely, Lady Jane. Well, I mean, you want to look good. For you, I mean, you wouldn't want to be just casual. I mean, you want to look best. Oh, and look at the execution. You know, they use professionals. Okay, these are trained. They usually there was a school in France where you got your license to execute. Because axes, I've never used an axe much myself, but I gather I'm not an axe person. But I think it really takes a skill, because you want it right the first time. That's a serious consideration. So there he is, and you just imagine, and you're thinking, probably there's a clergyman around, and there's her personal maid there. But it's a beautiful, you say, isn't that a little romantic? I think just a wee bit. But there you have it, Lady Jane Grey's execution. You say, why was she, the so-called 9-day queen, why was she executed? She was executed because Edward VI tried to get away with not following his father's wishes. And it is said, I don't know how much evidence that is, but it is said that the people of England supported Henry VIII's will, which was that after Edward, his sisters should rule. Whether England would have been better had Lady Jane gotten the throne, I don't know, because you think about that father-in-law. Oh, by the way, he's headed for the obituaries. Okay, so if you were thinking he went into retirement, no. He is headed for purgatory on the fastest conveyance going. So yes, that whole gang of, husband, father-in-law, Tower of London is very, very busy. Yeah, that is I think they call that a growth industry. Yeah, during this Tudor period, they just keep eliminating them. I know that was bad. So, I called them overt and acceptable, and I like that because, it's like we've come a long way from Henry VIII's in defense of the seven sacraments, because back in the day, you weren't even supposed to talk about things like justification by faith or sacraments in both kinds or marriage and all of that. Well, of course, times change. And there is no doubt that much of the responsibility for the developments will go to Cranmer. And Cranmer is definitely, and I hope some of my other students of Episcopalian leanings will agree with me, that Cranmer was definitely evolving in terms of his own belief system. Now, not everyone has been pro-Cranmer enough. Some have said he's simply somebody who could believe whatever was popular at that time, and they bring up, our poor friend in the trunk. Okay, baby, you can come out now. And they think, is this really a man of courage, a man of true belief? Well, maybe not entirely. But as his beliefs grew in Protestant ideas with the greater freedom afforded him in the reign of Edward VI, he became a great force in what can only be considered a changing church in England. Because remember, old Henry VIII in purgatory hell can't do anything about it anymore. So, to hell with your 6 acts. Get it? To hell with, So, it's all changing. It's all changing. And you can't do anything about it. So, it's really amazing if you stop and think about what the new, improved Thomas Cranmer can get accomplished. However, once Lady Jane Grey gets axed, here comes Mary, as in cocktail time, Bloody Mary, and she remembers how her mother got treated. And that will be a very, very interesting tale. The new queen, Queen Mary I. And remember, I have a reason for saying that. Remember, there is a Mary II. A lot of us forget about her. She's part of William and Mary, and we forget about her number sometimes, but she was Mary II. But this is the first Mary, the daughter of Henry and Catherine. If they had had therapists back then and counselors, I can only imagine that she would have, the counselor that is, could have made a lot of money. because I'm thinking a lot of time on the couch. That was a girl who had troubles. And we can understand if you start singing Mighty Fortresses or other great Lutheran hymns, I think she would tell you to cut it out. I just think that her whole life, her whole meaning was so much based on Catholic tradition that we understand that she was not going to accept the changes that had gone on as she grew up to womanhood. Yes, humiliated, separated. If she wasn't altogether a pleasant person, I think we can understand that she had certainly not been treated pleasantly. She was devoted to her mother, but for reasons that escape me, they were kept separated by her father, and yet thinking that this would never happen, she was given the second rank in the succession. Because of course they assumed Edward II would grow up, be a man, be married, have children, and Mary would just presumably be married off to someone for political reasons. So, she was now single and a devout Catholic and the ruler. With Lady Jane Grey and company all dead, she now was in a position, so she thought, to restore the faith that had existed up to her father. So she was definitely, as they say today, retro, wanting to go as things had been in the past. But first comes romance. Yes. And as I say, those family reunions, they can often bring out love. And boy, she was smitten by her cousin. The son of Charles V, Philip II, who became so famous in Spanish and English history, was in fact a very fine representative of his grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Living as he was during the Protestant Reformation, I dare say that every monastery, every major center of Catholic faith, they would have a poster of him, because you know, everybody go, wow, he's so great. Because of course, he's Spanish, he's fierce, go Catholic, you know, all of that. Very, very enthusiastic on behalf of the faith, because of course, that was in his own interests. Why were they married? Well, she was smitten, and I don't know if the word smitten would apply to his feelings for her. I think he viewed his cousin Mary as an interesting way for him to add England to his realm. Might I add that, to avoid complications, I have noted that much of Charles V's empire went to his brother. He gave Spain and the New World to his son Philip. But that's still a nice haul. And England, with its own interests added to it, it makes a guy think, well, she's not that great, but I can marry her, you know. It'll be okay. It'll all work out. She can we'll have a nice baby, and then who knows. But he married her. It was not a popular marriage with the English, so they say. He never was, as far as I'm aware, made king of England, sort of like our Prince Philip of today. he's sort of like husband to the queen, and neither Mary nor Philip liked that one little bit. They protested, and I'm amazed, really, that that was allowed. But it was, and he did not get to become king. I'm sure what he wanted was, of course, to have that title so that if something happened, Elizabeth, I'm going to keep England. But it didn't happen that way. So, despite the opposition of both Parliament and people, she now got her man, and they lived together relatively briefly while she tried to re-Catholicize as much as she could England. Now this is the person, when I was telling Ralph about a family tree of the Yorkists, this is her cousin, Cardinal Pole. This is really going to kill you. His grandfather was a Yorkist. So his grandfather was a brother of Edward IV and Richard III. Just kind of get that in your mind. Make a tree in your head. So Richard III and Edward IV. Remember little Edward V? Yeah. And so think about that. And then you have another line, George, Duke of Clarence, and that would be his grandfather. So he was cousins to Queen Mary. That's all you really need to know. And so he had risen up through the ranks of the church, spent a lot of time in Rome, but he and Henry VIII weren't close, let's put it that way. He didn't get to come to the reunion, so I'll put it that way. And he stayed in Rome, and of course, during the time of Edward VI, he was definitely persona non grata. And then Mary becomes queen, and she says, Cousin Reggie, come on home. This is great. Catholic days are here again. Go big RC. Yeah. So, there were plans, and Pole was to be, she made him Archbishop of Canterbury, already a cardinal, and they hoped that they could work all this out as a team. Of course, how much can you really bring back? I don't think the great families say, oh, we didn't want all that land, shucks. It belongs to the Lord. Let's give it back to Jesus. Yeah, no. That's going to be a problem, a real problem. On behalf of, I guess, all the terrible sinners of England, so it was said that Pole came before Parliament, and all the people in Parliament got on their knees to receive absolution from the Pope for having sinned by acknowledging royal supremacy, and all that sort of thing. Basically, in other words, Pole says, I bring you forgiveness from the Pope. Now say, you're sorry. And then they say they're sorry. And then, so, because of course, Mary wants everybody to be Catholic. It's not like whatever you're comfortable with. I just want you to be happy. It's like, no, I say you're Catholic and now you're Catholic. So, that's where it's going, and Pole is definitely part of the plan, and he was a valuable ally. She does get, and we all do, a point that you ask people, and those of you who've been teachers, you know that feeling when you've given people a chance to act better, and you say, now, if you don't do that, I'm going to get angry. Well, I think that happened to Mary. And that's when she got into that tomato juice vodka stage that we know her for. I don't think she started out that way. She just thought everybody was going to say, you know, you're right. I really wasn't comfortable with those Lutheran ideas. I think this whole Catholic business is just the way to go. But I think when people persisted, that's when the so-called Marian persecutions began. Marian from Mary, persecutions which have gained quite a bit of fame, in large part, of course, because the number of them, while not tremendously large, were played up by Protestant writers during the reigns of Queen Elizabeth and later on. These are our heroes. These are the great ones. And if you've been to Oxford, right outside, and you may have seen this, those of you who've been, right there, have you seen that corner, the Martyrs Memorial? Well, it's worth seeing. I think it's very interesting because they did lock up Thomas Cranmer. And apparently he did renounce his faith, but then after he renounced it, then he said, I didn't really mean to renounce it. And so they said, okay, well, you know what that means. And of course, that meant that he was going to be executed. And so this is the burning of Thomas Cranmer. And this Cranmer Memorial, which is now, every time I've seen it, been some sort of protest going on, which had nothing to do with Anglicanism, I might add. But there are always folks protesting something. But they are there in Oxford, and that was the execution of Thomas Cranmer, and dramatically, of course, putting his hand out in the fire to indicate how he had regretted not accepting his fate initially. Now, his apologists say the reason for that was that he believed so much in royal supremacy that if one, I know, I hear somebody laughing, and it is a really stretched out rationale, but this explanation is basically that he believed so in the doctrine of royal supremacy that if Queen Mary went another way, then he must be wrong. Whatever the case, he is now dead, and as many people do, Mary had created a lot of martyrs which helped the Protestant cause, even as, of course, she was grieving very, very much. Yeah? Not looking happy now. And you think, well, yeah, but she's got her Spanish cousin right there by her side. I'm not so sure about that. I need to get back to Madrid, Senora. You know, this has been great. We've had some good times. And I'll check back with you. But basically, she had failed to fulfill the purpose of the marriage, and whether or not he had plans to return to her, time did not permit, because of course she would die. The ironic thing to me has always been that she and Philip ended up in a conflict with the Pope. And I know. Can you just think how sad is that? Because I mean, they love their Pope. I mean, they're Pope people, right? And then they involved in a political dispute because he doesn't like Spanish, because the Spanish have been so involved in Italian affairs, and he's a real go big guy, go Italy, you know? And so he doesn't like her, and so of course she's saying, but I love my Philip. And then he's allied to France. So yes, it gets complicated. That doesn't mean, of course, he's going to excommunicate Mary. I mean, it's just that it's not a good relationship. So you say, what's going well for Mary in her reign? I don't know. I can't think of anything, frankly, because she even lost Calais. Yeah, that's it. We lose Calais, we've lost everything. You know, we're just a memory in France. The loss of Calais, which they had held since the 14th century, is part of her reign. And Philip's not around anymore, and I'm not pregnant. And so basically, it is tragic, and with, of course, the succession of her younger sister becoming ruler after her, she now will die the very same day as Cardinal Pole. It's kind of like Jefferson and Adams, isn't it? Except in this case, they were close friends and relatives. Pole and Queen Mary. Queen Mary does not really leave a legacy. She is the last, I would suppose, full-hearted and all her life dedicated Catholic. But to me, she is like going back into the past thanks to her mother. And of course, Philip of Spain was no help to her whatsoever. She was being used by him to advance his cause because, as you know, since the days of his grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabella, Spanish rulers had great world interests and wealth aspirations. And that bode very poorly for the English because once her sister gets on the throne and she's young and she's unmarried, guess who will come calling? Buenos dias, sister-in-law. Yes, it's that. Oh, I know you miss Maria. I miss her too. And so maybe we need to be together. You know, it's like, yeah, that politics, it can really be a strange business. And of course, we all know that means we are now ready for the great one. The last of the Tudors, I would think the one that makes it worthwhile. We have gone through some interesting people. I'll call them that. Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and now Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, the great ruler who will round out the Tudors. And there we'll begin next week. Thank you. He didn't give me my signal, so I didn't know. So